Welcome to the LSE for this hybrid event. My name is Armine Ishkanian, and I'm the Executive Director of the Atlantic Fellows, the Social and Economic Equity Program, and Professor in the Department of Social Policy at the LSE. I'm very pleased to be here to welcome Professor Facundo Alvaredo, Professor Stephen Durlauf, Professor Kramer, and Professor Phillips to both our online audience and to our audience here at LSE. Professor Facundo Alvaredo is a Professorial Research Fellow at LSE's International Inequalities Institute. He is also co-director of the World Inequality Database and the World Inequality Lab. His research is centered in the fields of public economics, the inequality of income and wealth, and the economic history of capitalism. Welcome.
Yep.
Professor Stephen Durlauf is a leading scholar in inequality research. He is the founding director of the University of Chicago's Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility. He is known for integrating sociological ideas into economic theories of inequality, poverty, and intergenerational mobility, as well as for research that elucidates how statistical analysis can reveal the mechanisms underlying various dimensions of inequality. Professor Larry Kramer has been President and Vice-Chancellor of LSE since April 2024. A constitutional scholar, university administrator, and philanthropic leader, Larry was previously the president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and the dean of Stanford Law School. And last but not least, we have Professor Phillips, who is a feminist political theorist whose work addresses a range of issues of inequality. Her publications include The Politics of Presence, Which Equalities Matter, Multiculturalism Without Culture, The Politics of the Human, and Unconditional Equals. Anne is an emeritus professor at LSE, which she joined in 1999 as director of the Gender Institute. She later moved to the Department of Government, where she held the Graham Wallace Chair in Political Science. This event is part of the III at 10, New Directions in Inequality Research, a 2-day conference celebrating the 10th anniversary of the International Inequalities Institute. This event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available on the III's YouTube channel, subject to no technical difficulties. So, as usual, there will be an opportunity for you to put your questions to our speakers. I will let you know when we will open the floor for questions. If you could please raise your hand, and then I will indicate and you can pose your question. Kindly indicate your name and affiliation if possible. So, without further ado, we're going to begin with Professor Stephen Durlauf.
So I have some slides. Thank you. Well, it's a great honor to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you. What I'm going to do is make 2 suggestions in inequality research. One of them will be relatively technical and narrow, and one will be maybe a little more controversial. In doing this, obviously, it's going to be somewhat self-serving, as I'm going to describe things that I'm currently working on. The other thing, of course, is to say that it's going to have a somewhat American-specific focus. In other words, what's in the back of my mind are issues in American inequality. And so I'm going to formulate things in that context. The first comment I wanted to make was that I think that one of the most important areas of inequality research, frankly, is measurement. In other words, the development of inequality statistics that capture normally salient features of inequality. If you think about this, conventional statistics in inequality, things such as the intergenerational elasticity of income, or dare I say, the second largest eigenvalue of a Markov transition matrix, these have well-posed mathematical properties, but they don't naturally map to the sorts of phenomena that we care about in terms of thinking about the injustices of inequality. And I think that this is an area that has had some successes, but warrants much more consideration. So to push on that, let me say first that one of the great successes of this institute is the development of measures of inherited inequality, which are actually asking to what extent characterizations of background circumstances for which individuals are not responsible, in fact, are determining the overall inequality measures that we work with. And so that's a perfect example of something in which we have advances in research, which are normatively more salient measures than are conventional. The second example I would give there is work that tries to develop theories or measures of bottlenecks in the intergenerational mobility process. And so what would a bottleneck be? The idea that there's certain configurations of family background, gender, race, et cetera, that make upward mobility particularly problematic. And that's another area in which I think that there's been substantial successes. What I'd like to do to add to that is to make an argument that in thinking about this notion that we want to ask, what are the configurations that are predictive of outcomes that people are not responsible for? And is we want to move beyond scalar variables to actually think about trajectories. So what do I mean by that? Individuals have life courses. And so focusing on birth to age 18, it's not just a matter that one has a family that has a statistic called average income, or a scalar occupation for parents, or a scalar family structure, or a single neighborhood, but rather in real time, individuals are experiencing trajectories. And I think that once one does that, makes that explicit, one can get new insights. So let me give you an example of that. So this is work that I've done with Yu-Sung Chang, Sung-Hee Lee, and June Park. And here's the question. The conventional measure in economics for intergenerational mobility is the intergenerational elasticity of income. What happens if you raise income by a percentage in permanent income? Suppose I thought of a child as being exposed to a trajectory, incomes at every age. Would something new emerge? What turns out to happen, and again, the trajectory is collectively something one is not responsible for. It is a circumstance. One finds the following, and that is early childhood incomes are in fact not particularly predictive of adult outcomes. There's almost, in fact, there's a monotonicity. And so it's the adolescent years in which incomes are particularly salient. Now, it drops at age 18 for the standard reason that Americans think that your obligations to children change. And so that's it's a nice, proof of concept that we pick up a cultural issue. But the point I want to make is the following, that if I ask the question, why does income matter for children? This tells us something important, is that we would want to think about it as a circumstance in which what is done with income matters. You buy the necessities of life for a toddler. What is it you buy for adolescents? Schools and neighborhoods. And so once you have you basically ask, here's the richer conception of circumstance, unpack it, and you begin to see something about mechanisms. One can in fact decompose this, and this is a technical part, is to say that if you ask what it is about these family trajectories, it turns out that there's really two factors there. One, the usual suspect of permanent income does have a salient effect. That's the first principal component in mathematical terms. But the second thing is there's a second component which has very little influence until we get to age 13 or so. And so my point is that the formal mathematics, the statistics, actually tells us something about the way that inequality is functioning. Here's a second example of a trajectory. These are standardized test score gaps between ethnic groups in the United States, starting with age 5 and going through age 22. Why did I put this on the table? Because not only do we want to think about trajectories in terms of the generative mechanisms for inequality, we want to think about trajectories of the outcomes themselves. And so in thinking about racial inequality in the United States, which is obviously first order in thinking about American inequality, we have to have a vision of the mechanisms that explains why gaps are opening up at age 5 and they are not being corrected by the educational system and by the various phenomena that are happening all the way through college towards law school. So the upshot is that I think that measurement, which may often sounds technical, is in fact fundamental to thinking about mechanisms. The second thing I want to put on the table is that I think that inequality research should engage more directly with meritocracy. In other words, we often think about inequalities because of whether or not a person is responsible for them, and that is obviously ethically salient. But there are other ideas, and that is saying that there's a sense in which individuals may or may not deserve things. And it is certainly very powerful in terms of public opinion. And so in thinking about how one creates a political consensus for ameliorating inequalities, we have to take this seriously. Notice that this is not an anti-egalitarian perspective, because then you can ask the question, are there unmerited inequalities in a society? And here's the argument I want to make. And of course, I have to cite Amartya Sen, who's whose name is on Chico's chair. And that is, we have to talk about specific context to ask how we would think about meritocracy. And so if I were then go down the line saying, well, let's think about student assignments to classrooms, admissions to universities, the assignments of jobs, this is the key point I want to make. And that is, conventional discussions of meritocracy are retrospective. There's some intrinsic notion of desert. You should have a claim of something because of characteristics you have. A different idea, and this is what I'm trying to promote in current research, is to think about prospective meritocracy, which says that merit is an individual's contributions to the objective function of an organization. You hire somebody prospectively based on how productive they're going to be. You admit somebody to a school because of what they're going to contribute to the school and what they're going to contribute to the labor market afterwards. Once you think that way, that leads you to think about the dynamics of meritocracy. In other words, what does it mean to sort children in a classroom at age 5? Once you go down these types of reasoning, you have some, I think, things that are surprising. For example, affirmative action under prospective meritocracy can be meritocratic. Why is that? You set a circle objective in terms of how you would like the distribution of skills in a society. You have to ask questions at each stage as to what the assignments are of children to classrooms, students to universities, graduates to professional schools, in order to maximize these objectives. You get a very different vision of things. The final comment to make is that, that's the second final, is to say the following, and that is, once one thinks about prospective meritocracy dynamically, a very important issue arises that I think is fundamental to inequality, and that is the excess segregation of societies. In other words, the idea that you would actually assign children at 5 years old to class, track them by class, so on and so forth. All that turns out, once you sort of formalize this, to be examples in which you have static meritocratic notions that are dynamically unmeritocratic. And the upshot of taking this type of approach is phenomena like affirmative action can be meritocratic. Many contexts in which we sort people on putatively meritocratic grounds turn out not to be so. And the upshot is that I think that gives us another vision of the sorts of inequalities that need to be addressed. And so if somebody would ask me, what is my one-word summary of the problems of American inequality, I would have said segregation. Segregation of neighborhoods, of schools, of individuals and jobs, so on and so forth. And so I think that by taking meritocracy seriously, it opens up the political domain, and it also gives us different ways to think about the generative mechanisms of inequality and why we have inefficient inequalities in contemporary society. That's all I need, because if I have only one final comment, and that is, it's the most important set of observations, and that is that by definition, any organization that lasts 10 years has a 10th anniversary. But this is a meaningful 10th anniversary because the International Inequalities Institute's been at the forefront of inequality research. And I think the deepest congratulations are due to it for a splendid achievement. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A second speaker.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And I think that kind of follows on actually quite well, because what I particularly want to talk about is my kind of worries about some of the compartmentalization that sometimes develops in inequality research. I mean, I think one of the biggest contributions that places like the Inequalities Institute has made to research on inequality is in providing reliable evidence on the nature and scale of contemporary inequalities in income, wealth, in opportunities. And we can see, certainly in the UK, we can see how much this is needed, because the official statistics on this, including the Wealth and Assets Survey, are widely regarded as completely useless. So independent social science research on this really matters. And what I want to say in no way is intended to take away from the importance of this, but I do worry that the very success and topicality of research on the deepening inequalities in income and wealth can turn the spotlight away from more intractable, less quantifiable, but no less important aspects of inequality. Aspects that certainly stretch beyond a more narrowly defined economic sphere. It can turn the spotlight away from inequalities of power, of rights, and of status that, to my mind, are very much at the heart of why people object to inequality. So if you think about the great egalitarian movements of the past centuries, if you think about the struggles to end slavery, the struggles against the immiseration of the working classes, which interestingly was very often described as wage slavery, so with power in there. The struggles to end the subordination and oppression of women, to end the violence and exploitations of colonialism. What was at stake in these was always a combination. All of them involve claims to a more just, a more equitable share of the world's resources. But also, and in many ways more centrally, all of them were responding to unchecked and often violent exercises of power. And they all challenged the assumptions of superiority that took some groups, whether by virtue of their wealth, their gender, their skin color, their nationality, whatever, that took some groups to be inherently better, in some contexts, inherently more human than others. And I think we see the same kind of combinations in political movements today. So if you think about mobilizations against racism or misogyny, they always challenge inequalities in resources, in health, in opportunities, but also are especially vocal about the violence and the disparagement and the way in which some kinds of individuals get to be treated as lesser than, inferior to others. And even protests that look to be more specifically economic in their focus are never just about challenging poverty or challenging income gaps or obscene levels of wealth. They're also always about inequalities in power, the kind of the power that flows from those inequalities in income and wealth, like the being required to work in dangerous conditions, the insecurity of people's lives, the sense that one doesn't have a voice in the decisions that crucially affect your work and your communities. And I think one could also say that those perceived inequalities of power are a factor even in the otherwise anti-egalitarian mobilizations that are very much at the heart of today's politics, mobilizations against immigrants, refugees, multiculturalism, so-called wokeness. I think it's now quite widely acknowledged that these mobilizations can't be understood just as a response to stagnating living standards or impoverished material circumstances. These are an element, certainly. But much of what powers these movements is, again, people feeling they're not being treated as equals, they're not being heard, their voices are not being taken seriously. So basically, my point is that wherever we go with future research on inequality, it needs to engage, perhaps more fully than it always does, with this combination. Inequality is about resources, it's about power, it's about rights, it's about respect. It's about fundamentally about whether one exists as an equal in one's own society. The distribution of income and wealth is one crucial component of this. And where it's as skewed as it currently is, it translates into very important inequalities of power, rights, and standing. Those with little in the way of income and wealth are all too frequently regarded as if they are actually worthless, as if they're insignificant people. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that inequalities in income and wealth are the only thing that lead to people being treated in this way, or that resource inequality is always the most important element in the way we experience inequality. I mean, I'm struck by the way in which it seems to me that for many people today, the kind of the extraordinary wealth of the world's richest individuals seems to inspire awe and admiration rather than a kind of burning sense of injustice. I suppose I'm thinking of, like the attention given to pronouncements by Elon Musk, for example, while flawed ideas of meritocracy already touched on have successfully embedded themselves in much of the popular imagination, even when blatantly at odds with what some people supposedly earn. People seem to adjust themselves relatively readily, or perhaps just resign themselves to gross inequalities in income and wealth. But they give the impression they're not prepared to live with the feeling that they themselves are dismissed or despised. So I should just clarify at this point that, in arguing this, I'm not arguing that economic inequality is less important than we think it is. And I'm certainly not trying to somehow pit economic equality against other inequalities of power, rights, or status. I've never been a fan of what people call sufficientarianism, the idea that if we just manage to give people enough for a decent standard of living, then we shouldn't actually worry about the remaining inequalities between people. Eliminating poverty is clearly crucial, but tackling economic inequality is also very important, including for the reasons that I've indicated, which is that those with less money often end up being regarded as lesser people. But the causal mechanisms don't go just one way. Sometimes it's because a particular group has come, for whatever historical reasons, to be regarded as of lesser standing. It's because of that that group is then more vulnerable to high levels of economic exploitation. And sometimes it's the other way around. The different inequalities are always connected, but I think they're connected differently in different ways, in different contexts. And so it seems to me that one of the pressing challenges, but actually very difficult challenges, because it certainly doesn't lend itself to easy measurement. But one of the pressing challenges is to identify exactly how things are connected, how they combine at any particular moment. And this moment that we're in at the moment is, I think, a particularly difficult one, because we have rapidly rising economic inequalities, but it coincides with a widespread anti-egalitarianism, where it seems many people now disregard, even sneer at the value of equality. So it's a particularly challenging moment for us. Much of what was taken for granted in previous decades, like the need to ensure social welfare, to refuse the harsh individualism that leaves people to either kind of sink or swim, to tackle and legislate against discrimination on the grounds of race, gender, or sexuality. Much of that can no longer be assumed to be the consensus. So there are things about our own period that make it particularly troubling and distinctive. And I think that work on inequality needs to grapple with that, as well as kind of documenting the important inequalities in income, wealth, and opportunities that I think the International Inequalities Institute has done so much to further research on. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much to Chico and the Institute for the invitation. Knowing what I think, sometimes it's a bit of a risk to having me here. So it is always difficult to say something meaningful in general. In 10 minutes, it's almost impossible. So what does meaningful mean in our context? Today, it means it's saying something that artificial intelligence cannot say by itself in a fraction of a second. So first of all, I asked ChatGPT, I described this conference, this panel, and I asked, what should I say? How should I approach this panel? And the robot replied instantly, if you want to sound professional and authoritative, the SMART stance is a mainstream social science consensus framing. The robot knows us very good. And it went on with 5 bullet points. Don't laugh, this may be based on your research on the conference. It went on with 5 bullet points with a very comprehensive list of topics: distribution of national accounts, equality of opportunity, taxation, the distribution effects of carbon taxes. And I complained and said, come on, you have not even asked first my ideological stance. And ChatGPT replied, you are right, here you have 3 more options for you to choose. A Marxist framing with topics, an anti-woke framing, a progressive framing. And I said, okay, in desperation, but what should I say? What am I? I did something I didn't want to do. This is serious. I revealed my identity, and the chat said, without hesitation, you are a reformist social democrat. You should go for number 1. And the statement killed me. It made me very sad and angry because the chat is wrong about me. I am not that, but I have to admit at the same time that the chat is right too. And how is it possible that it can be wrong and right at the same time? Well, because some of us, all of us, a few of us, me, we live split lives. On the one hand, I live in what I call the respectable framework. You have mainstream, heterodox, whatever you want, you can put in what I call the respectable framework. And I do my papers, my data production, my statistical methods, the conference, the papers, the presentations. But I also do what the chat ignores is an intellectual obligation to continue what I call the scientific project of political economy. The chat up to now, it seems it ignored that. The video will be uploaded, so I am showing the chat. So let's focus on the respectable framework for a moment. Still, as the examples have been mentioned, much serious work has to be done in the respectable framework. What is meaningful in that case, in my view, is if you are doing meaningful research, if the doctrine or the theory is backed into a corner, you ask a limiting question to the theory, to the doctrine. Usually, in my experience, this is the best examples of this is provided by great scholars, which are very honest and faithful to the doctrine. And I put one example, which starts with an observation. The profit share has been rising. This is in the respectable framework acceptable. I can show you the data for the United States from the Federal Reserve. The profit share has been rising enormously in the last 40 years. Larry Summers, bluntly, he takes that and says, oh, this is a serious concern. Capital has been changing. It's not what we thought. It is not what we thought it was. It is not only the capital of the production function. It's not only that it is replacing or substituting labor. It's changing in more profound ways. So he concludes, this is the reason for which we can see increasing output, stagnant wages, stagnant household incomes, and increasing the profit share. And he foretells this will play out over the next generation and will put pressure on the distribution of income. Tony Atkinson takes this, a footnote about Tony. If you read Tony's papers with care, you will see that all the papers are full of open doors to unexplored inequality path, full. So that's to be taken into account. So Atkinson takes this and says, if Larry Summers is right, and he thinks he's right, the crucial question is who owns the robots? And goes further on and says, we should look to a situation where the state acquires beneficial ownership, not control, of capital and uses the profit to share the benefits among citizens. This is not me, it's Larry Summers and Tony Atkins. But what do you feel? My implications from this, these are surprising conclusions from within the respectable framework. These two people pushing the theory and the doctrine to the limit. What is Larry Summers saying? Something like the metamorphosis of capital. Tony Atkinson is implying expropriation. So these are things that we need to reconsider because this is happening within the respectable framework. Second point, a consistent theoretical framework for this is still missing. We don't have an explanation. We have scholars, framework, we have a model author talking about this, but not a consistent general theory. Atkinson says more, says the narrative about taxation and redistribution may be helpful to reduce inequality, but it is clearly insufficient. Otherwise, he wouldn't point to the ownership of robots. And finally, this is my view, this forces us to think that we need to rethink all key terms conceptually: property, control, capital, ownership, the state, power, citizenship, and nationality. The problem is that the conceptual work, this is my personal view, the conceptual work on these keywords cannot be done within the respectable framework. So I come here with a plea. You are young, many of you are very young, you will be leading the field in a couple of years or in a number of years. So my plea is we need to keep doing our work within the serious work within the respectable framework. There are many questions unanswered, but it is a plea. We still need to breathe life to the scientific project of political economy. This project has been abandoned in the 19th century. Why it was abandoned? It had problems, we know, but it also was abandoned because the conclusions were nasty. It revealed that our society is based on exploitation. The word exploitation only belongs to the political economy project, not to the respectable framework. It cannot be pronounced because it doesn't belong to the theory. It's a theoretical problem. Exploitation does not belong to the respectable framework, but we do inequality. You cannot tell me that we can do without that word. Less. So this is this book. I added two. The plea also includes that the conceptual work can only be done within the continuation of the scientific project of political economy. I added, I'm sorry, still two final points. Measurement is very important. I have done measurement all my life, adult life, but will not get us away from conceptual confusion. And for those of you who like the history of thought, you have the Tycho and Kepler debate and problems. Tycho had all the data. He couldn't do anything with that. And I put finally, meaningful social change requires an updated theory, and the construction of an updated theory is a collective behavior. I didn't want to scare you because the original sentence is, there is no revolution without a revolutionary theory, which was written by Plekhanov in the 19th. Thank you.
So hard to follow that. That was like such a smart use of AI. And I will, before I start, just put in a plug, we are actually, I think the political economy project was actually abandoned in the mid-20th century. So I think Keynes and Schumpeter are at the end of it. We're actually in the middle of trying to resurrect it here, just so you know, and working on launching an institute for the political economy, because I think that's right. I come at this a little differently, only in the following sense. I did a lot of scholarship on inequality, albeit from an American constitutional perspective, in my early career. The 10 years, 12 years I've spent in philanthropy to change my perspective, not on inequality, but on how to think about the relevance and of scholarship to actually addressing real world problems. You get a very different perspective when you discover there's a whole lot of people out there who are looking for answers, and they won't look to the academy, even though there's so much work being done because it's not speaking to them. So I just want to offer 4 points that at least come at it from that perspective. So the first, and these are things to think about as we work in this field. First, I think we need a much better handle on what it is exactly that we're studying. And I said, what is, because there is no problem of inequality any more than there is a disease called cancer. Cancer turns out to be multiple diseases, and if you treat them all as the same, or you say they're just aspects of the same disease, you're gonna fundamentally come up with the wrong kind of remedies. And I think the same thing can be said for inequality, thinking about inequality of power versus inequality of, well, actually, let's say access to, well, actually even more. Political power, say through the vote or whatever that is, versus, access to energy or broadband. These are not the same question. They fall differently on different people, and we need to think about them somewhat differently. Likewise, one of the major areas, when I was younger, we would talk about the distinction between formal equality or inequality and substantive equality or inequality, which is somehow morphed into some notion that there's inequality and there's inequities. And the way those terms are used, it's so different by so many different people. There's so much confusion in the field. So to some extent, I think we need scholarship that develops a typology and common language. So we know what are the different problems that we're talking about, and I think can think more clearly about each of them. There are different kinds of inequalities that takes place in different settings, and all those distinctions actually turn out to matter to understanding them. And as a result, by the way, we often end up with people talking past each other without even recognizing that they're doing it. Second problem follows from the first, which is recognizing, once you recognize that there are different problems of equality or inequality, you can see the different issues as aspects of larger problems. And understanding that, I think, also will change the way you think about the question of equality or inequality, particularly because we're at a point in time where not only must we, but we have an opportunity to advance solutions in large problem areas in which inequalities are embedded. So we need to think about how do we address the problem of inequality as we address the larger problem. So if you think about the democracy problem, there are many aspects of the democracy of our democratic systems that are producing failures, not just the fact that there's unequal voice within the systems. And we're going to need to address those problems. We need to think about, as we address those problems, as we fix a system so as to give people voice, how do we also make sure, for instance, that people who had less voice than others because of systemic inequalities, we can address that as part of the problem. As we think about the transition to a new energy system, which we're going to have to do, how do we make sure that the costs of that transition aren't borne by the same people who seem always to bear those costs? That's addressing the inequality problem as we address the climate problem. It's also a very different problem than the problem of voice in the democracy, and so on. Same thing is true for new technologies, which present enormous risks as well as potential benefits that we're going to need to figure out how to address. And as we do that, how do we assure equal access to the technologies and to the benefits of those technologies, and so on. Political economy being the most obvious one of the problems that we need to address in our political economy, not just our economies, go well beyond and include many issues other than the inequality issues, but it's an opportunity to address inequality issues as we do so. So it's recognizing that inequalities are embedded in other problems that we need to address at the same time. One of the key reasons for that is because what you end up with in the world is zero-sum framings. And the zero-sum framings then defeat your ability to get anything done. When I was working on political economy, again, from the foundation's perspective, it was often being put to us, you either were concerned about income inequality or the racial wealth gap, and you could not be concerned about both. And if you were not concerned about the racial wealth gap, then you were racist. And that whole framing of things really defeated the ability to accomplish anything on either side of that problem. So that's the second point. Third point for me would be that there's a huge amount of the work in this field that's positive and descriptive and super important to do that mapping, the extents, the places, the who exact, all the various, whichever form of inequality you're dealing with. There's also a lot of the work that's normative and begins to move towards thinking about what we should do about it and how we should do it. And this is really a simple piece of advice. It doesn't actually matter which of those traditions you're within. All of them can be argued, presented in ways that will be understood and accepted by people in different traditions, and we tend not to do that. Which is to say, scholars, more so than everybody else, need a little bit degree of political astuteness and how they're making their arguments, because there's no point in making the argument if you do it in a way that is going to be rejected out of hand, not because of the idea, but because of the language you're choosing and the way you're choosing to argue the point. So the inside baseball kind of language jargon, that used to be the complaint, that's actually less the problem these days than it is, and this is particularly true in what was up there as the progressive tradition, is presenting the arguments in a way and using language and framings that before they even think about the argument, you've lost a huge part of the audience that you need to persuade. So that would be my third point to you, to think about this scholarship going forward. The beauty of what we can do is develop ideas that can actually change the world, but not if we present them in ways that no one in the world wants to listen to. And then the last point, the difficulty of creating partnerships between scholars of the global north and the global south. Even that language is not a problem yet, right? There was a long period of time in which, and it's unquestionably true, scholars in the developed world and in the global north wrote about things, thought about things, presented them as if the global south didn't exist. There was a whole lot of interesting work going on there. There was a whole lot of interesting ideas. But we've now moved to a world where very much of it is we're at risk of just flipping that over to the other side. And now this is more a problem for funders than it is for scholars, but if you look at the way funding is going, there's a whole lot of the resources that we need. Where I'm not going to fund any universities or scholars in the global north. We need to put all of our funding and resources into the global south. Not recognizing that the only way for real progress to be made here is going to require partnerships along both dimensions. There's still so much intellectual capital, so many resources, so many smart people in the global north, that the key is to have scholars in both of those parts of the world, and I don't mean like that, frankly, it's like all over the world, actually listening to each other, talking to each other, and that's going to require a more self-conscious effort to think about how we do partnerships. And again, it's a question of what kind of language we use, who we invite, how we talk about this. So if you're asking me about future directions in inequality research, those are at least 4 things that I think it's useful to keep in mind as you do your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the great presentations. We now have approximately 30 minutes for questions from the floor. Please raise your hand and I will select questions in rounds. And as I ask for your name and affiliation where possible, that would be fantastic. So, yes.
Terrific panel, Davide from the University of Cambridge. So I have many questions, but I will select one for Professor Facundo Alvaredo. And the question is provocative, but I want to hear you. Is China a successful case of the project, like a practical successful case, or what somehow you talk about collectively owning the robots? And I'm being provocative, but the question comes from the fact that many of my students see this, in the sense, see China as a successful case. And so, yeah, I put there the question.
The question says more about you than about my presentation, because I refer to conceptual thinking. So before saying China, and before saying China president, we need to develop lots of years, I don't know, months, weeks of conceptual thinking to see what we are watching, what's the object we are trying to analyze. There was a Russian thinker living in London in the 40s and 50s who said, who wrote a book. The title is Stalinist Russia, and said Russia is a centralized capitalist economy. Mm-hmm. For China, I could say the same. So you are relating the classical political economy project, I don't know, to communism. China, I haven't done that. I am not going to do that.
So we have 1, 2, 3, and then I see you. So over here.
Yeah, Michael Wright from the University of California at Berkeley. And I just want to comment on Facundo. Am I pronouncing your name well enough? I don't know. You know, I've for my whole career tried to find out how could we bring power and exploitation into economic theory. And the fundamental problem is that the mainstream or neoclassical economics treats labor and capital symmetrically. You can interchange the subscripts and you have the same exact model. And as Milton Friedman put it, workers are free to choose. And as long as you have that framework, you cannot get power and exploitation. However, there is another approach which has been developed originally in England by Joan Robinson and developed right here at LSE by Alan Manning, which looks at imperfect competition in the labor market. Workers don't have the freedom to leave whenever they want to because their choices are limited. I think you can find that in the 19th century writers, but it's very much what's becoming the main field, at least in American labor economics, is to start with imperfect competition. And I think that gives a scientific program to study these power and exploitation in ways that we didn't have before. Thank you.
That's a comment you want to reflect or?
Just one sentence. You cannot include exploitation in the traditional framework. It doesn't fit. It cannot go. That's why
But you can't get them out.
you have to.
Yeah. And it's all
no,
bugged me when people say
employers
they
have-
just ignored it, because it didn't ignore it, it just made an assumption, like so many of the assumptions in neoclassical economics that were just not true. So you can enrich the assumptions in other ways. It's there, it's able to be put into the models.
Does anyone want to reflect? I'm sure take the next question.
Well, just to say that it seems to me that one needs to be able to think about inequality in relation to domination. Whatever word one uses, power, domination, exploitation's in there, but and one of the problems with the ways that we have, I mean, there are many people today many progressives today who don't like the idea of equality because they see it as kind of captured by a certain kind of liberalism that is very surface, that is like the formal equality that Larry was talking about. But if you can think about inequality in a way that actually engages with the domination that goes along with inequality, then we have more of a chance of getting beyond that kind of cul-de-sac.
Yeah, Bernard Casey from London and Frankfurt Social Economic Research. I wanted to pick up the M word because we have talked a lot about it. In other words, measurement. We talked just now about the wealth and assets survey in this country, but one has to recognize that the wealth and assets survey has been downgraded in terms of its status. I have done a lot of work on the labour force survey, very important, also downgraded in terms of its status because, again, of its reliability. Work on gender pay in this country via official statistics has also been questioned, the official data. We then come into the whole question of the politicization of measurement as well, and we have to look at places like what's been going on in the Bureau of Labour Statistics. So the M word by itself, it might be very virtuous, and maybe we spent an awful lot of our time at trying to get good measures, but actually our ability even to use the kind of sources which we have been using has become increasingly questionable, either because the job is not being done very well at all, or because people are rampantly politicizing it. Thank you.
Thank you. So there was a question. Maybe at this point, I might want to ask the panel, because, that was a question, I guess, or a comment to Stephen. You were the one talking quite a lot about the M word and the gentleman just said measurement. I want to invite the panel if they want to reflect on each other's comments before I take another round of questions.
This is an example of a coordination failure. Nobody wants to go first.
And you're from the University of Chicago, you're supposed to always know.
Well, I'm a Chicago economist only in one dimension. Actually, I found the discussion quite complimentary. In other words, I didn't hear disagreements. What I heard was part of the richness of this institute, which is the interdisciplinarity and the fact that it's trying to think about inequality from many perspectives. So that's my main reaction.
Yeah, so I kind of feared that I would be speaking on a platform with very kind of mainstream, respectable economists. And I have been rather disappointed in this respect, though I still think that the warnings that I have made are entirely important and to the point.
I would only add that we have a peculiar field in the discipline, I guess, talking from the economics perspective, where we are at a point where contradictions are more evident. From measurement, from meritocracy, from gender studies, we see from wealth concentration, we see contradiction all the time. And this is the place where the doctrine of the theory cracks. And in the sense, this is a great field, which allows all this viability and variety in topics.
I'm actually interested in questions, from the floor.
All right.
We had a lot of hands up.
So Kirsty was in. And then the individual there and then.
Thank you, and thank you for your fantastic presentations. As I was coming to the LSE this morning, I was thinking about the time when the II was founded and set up, and it felt like a very different time. So Piketty had just published his book on inequality. There was some degree of economic recovery before COVID. Yes, there were problems of populism, but it just feels like almost in these last 10 years, politically, we have regressed. And so while we know more in terms of data, we know more about what's going on in inequalities, we've certainly done an awful lot more research. When the Institute was founded, it felt like the door was open and, we were pushing against an open door. And now it feels a bit like the door's closing in on us. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I know Anne mentioned power, but I think an awful lot more needs to be said about this political or this authoritarian populism that we're dealing with now, where even left-wing governments, I'm never quite sure whether they don't know how to articulate an alternative or whether they don't dare articulate an alternative in the face of the extreme movements that are going on.
No, okay. So can I say something? I mean, I think that I think there is a fear. And I think the fear in terms of governments and politicians failing to find a way of responding to this. And I think the fear is that people think that equality is not popular. It's just, the time that you were talking about, there was a presumption that people disagreed about how much equality they thought was appropriate, but generally there was an assumption, which we now think, which is now frayed, absolutely, that equality was one of the things that standard liberal democracies were kind of committed to. So there's a real fear that if one simply challenges the anti-egalitarianism, that you expose the fact that that consensus has completely frayed. So I certainly don't have answers about, but I think that fear is a good deal of what's going on at the moment in the difficulties that politicians have in challenging what is a powerfully anti-egalitarian movement.
So the behind my comments was that experience, and although my experience is mostly in the US since I've been here, I think I've seen very much the same thing, and you've seen it almost everywhere else in the world, which is the problem was the way in which the inequality agenda was pursued. Right, so an opportunity opened up. People, why would anybody ever want to sort of, and here I'm thinking about the regular political problem, like concern themselves with making sure that other people have some view, because they have to feel well settled themselves, right? And if their own lives feel fragile and uncertain, if they're going to be willing to still think about that, it's got to be because they see something shared in it. And instead, the way the agenda was pursued was absolutely like, this is all that matters. Your problems do not. The election of Donald Trump in the United States there's no question in my mind that it is so much a product of the way in which progressives and the left pursued their agenda. Not that the agenda was bad, but they did it in a way. And you saw this not, by the way, I should say, if you look at the United States, it wasn't just within the white population, it was across all of the racial groups, was the sense I have a complicated life, I have many dimensions, and you're reducing me to one thing. And for the people who weren't that one thing, and you're saying that I don't matter and my problems don't matter. And so the idea of framing an equality agenda within nested in a larger problem where people will also see themselves, I think becomes absolutely critical if you want to actually make progress. So the moment where it occurred, everybody was feeling, reasonably good about their lives, and that moment actually begins to fall apart before 2008. But 2008 is the first marker. 2020 is the second one, because after 2020, the progressive agenda then really ramped it up when people were really feeling insecure in their own lives, their own futures, their own economies, and found themselves just being denied the same problem. And then, this is how we felt all along, was not a particularly good solution if you wanted to attract support. You need that support if you want to actually make progress. So I think this is recoverable, but it's not recoverable if the agenda remains. This is all that matters. Your problems, all of those aspects remain the case. And as I said, I think it was sharper in the US because the equality agenda had always been sharper in the US because race had always been sort of the central issue across American history in a way that's less true in Europe and many other parts of the world. But it was a similar kind of thing.
So I have, I'll take two this time, and then I think we're still in that.
Hello, thank you very much for the intervention. My name is Javier. I come from the OECD, so I guess I'm at the very, very mainstream and hopefully quasi-respected part of the field. I have a question regarding the intervention of Facundo. I think that many people that are working on inequalities as economists feel a little bit in the same way, right? Feel that they need to be divided between this sort of mainstream, technical, measurable sort of, production, scientific production, and a more sort of realization with our own contradictions and wanting to expand the way in which we think about these things more broadly. But at the same time, we are all the profession, at least in this field. You are the profession. I guess that many of us have reviewed in journals. Many of you have been editors of major journals. So I guess I have two questions. The first one is, what have we done wrong? Why have we ended up in a position in which this political economy project has been abandoned? And what is our shared responsibility in that? And I guess the second question is, how can we, within the constraints that we have, try to bring, and I'm talking here about the economics discipline, perhaps more than other disciplines that do this more often, bring those elements back, at least a little bit.
Thank you.
Hi, it's me at the back. My name is Masana Mulaudzi. I'm a cohort 1 senior fellow at the Atlantic Fellowship for Social and Economic Equity. And I just earlier today had a panel on what it's been to be an economist who's accepted my ancestral calling to heal people. And it's really interesting for me to be in this conversation. I'm really grateful for your contributions. I think, like Professor Phillips, I had a bit of cynicism around what a panel on new directions and inequality research would look like. And I'm really pleased to hear all of you call out for something more than line graphs and regressions. And I suppose I have two questions. The one is something that I feel is starkly missing in inequalities research, which I think points to your comments, Professor Phillips, is why we as Black feminist economists, so I am an economist, I was trained in classical economics, why we went to movement. And we didn't go to movement because of a sense of obligation or injustice. We went to movement because of a sense of love. We do this work because we love one another. We love the earth. We love our feminist sisters and brothers and queers. We love community. We are willing to be inconvenienced for the work. And continuously, I find myself in these academic conferences where no one is willing to talk about those realms of inequality. Who gets to love? Whose love is valid? Whose voice is valid? Who's showing up is valid? Whose theories of rationality are valid? And so my question to you as an esteemed panel of professors, my first question is, well, what's your theory of love? You know, what economics did to love is it turned it into theories of care work, right? And it created theories of an alternative economy by which women and everybody else exercises voice and choice and being and productivity. And now to call on you, Professor Alvaredo, like what does it look like to politicize love in a moment where the world is starved of connection? My second question is really around theories of status, because I felt really insecure on that panel, and I was with Erica, who gave a fantastic panel on the occult and marijuana legalization and its connection to the political economy and extraction. And both of us after that were reflecting on just how really insecure we feel in these spaces, these ivory towers that are very beautiful with perfect air conditioning. And I wonder if you ever feel that way. You know what would make me feel really great as a Black feminist economist is to hear someone quote my work and to refer to my theories of being, Lino Some, Stella Nyanzi, God, countless African feminists who've really charted the way in critical theory and thinking of liberation. I think the answers you're looking for exist. And so in your theories on status, how are you reflecting on the collective knowledge of those who will never get the chance to be in the plenary panel to evoke the spirits of new directions onto the world? And this is the final reflection that I'd love you to include, Armine. Last one, sorry. In a moment where artificial intelligence is threatening everybody because people want to be the most intelligent, and there's this big fear that something so intelligent would be capitalized, the robots would turn against us and be used for harm. What does it look like to hold intelligence and intellectualism as a collective asset? So in your reflection on status, how do you then share the platform to include that knowledge? Thank you.
So, maybe we could start with Facundo on the questions around why the political economy has been abandoned and how do we bring it back, and then colleagues want to address each of the questions from Masana about love or status and AI.
I'm sorry, this is a too broad question beyond this, the topic of this event and this panel. This is a problem in the history of economic thought, so we can discuss later about how, with other.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I'll venture an answer to that, though, that I think is relatively just a framing.
You're brave.
Well, I don't think it was abandoned. I think it carried along to a certain intellectual point where it changed. So again, not to simplify this, but and it is simplifying it. But essentially the neoliberal project swallowed it and sort of turned everything into a particular way to think about microeconomics. And at that point, the project kind of disappeared of itself because it was combined with two other developments that took place, which I think are really important to understand. And it actually goes to your question why you're not on plenary panels, why the kind of work you're doing doesn't get the same kind of attention, which is one was specialization. So there's this massive increase in the size of the academy that takes place post World War II. And a world in which, how do you make a name for yourself when there's so many people writing in your field? You can't all be addressing those same big questions. And we see this across fields. We see a massive increase in specialization. The way most people go, given the process, the tenure process and so on, is to drive towards smaller and smaller niches. And in economics, something that had really begun late 19th, early 20th century really takes off, which is one of the really good ways to do it, is to become very much a formal modeler, show how smart you are by using math and your ability to do that. And I think, you know, just as social explanations for what's going on, all those things are happening, combined with, again, in economics, not just the tenure process, but this weird notion that there's only 4 journals that you can publish in if you want to be thought of seriously. Yes, 5. Okay, 5. I didn't say before. So, you know, there was this process that took place across the sort of intellectual development combined with 2 sociological facts that I think have produced very much the world that we find ourselves in, which is starting to change, however. You also had that feeling. I mean, there is definitely a reemergence of thinking around political economy in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century way. It's still going to find difficulty, I think, getting purchase There is a question about the extent to which economists will be part of this, precisely because of these other two problems, but there are increasingly young economists also, as well as much older ones, I should say, who really want to really engage with that level. So I think there is some movement.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I'm not an economist, but I think that there's something about the institutional structure of universities at the moment and the world of academic publishing and so on, which is having this effect. I mean, I'm from a government political science background, exactly the same kind of focusing in on smaller and smaller questions that you can then accurately resolve. But they're small questions, and if you're thinking about inequality, you've actually got to address it in a big question way. And the particular intellectual architecture of universities today, it seems to me, is not very conducive to the kind of big questions that we need to be addressing, that are at the heart of anything like inequalities research. So you're constantly struggling against that.
So I'm going to dissent with some of the discussion in the following sense.
It's on.
It's on. I think some of the discussion of the economics discipline has been a stereotype. There's been massive change in the discipline over the last 20 years. The explosion of inequality research speaks for itself. With respect to political economy, the National Nobel Prize was for political economists. And so there's been, very important work done in that area. A third example is talking about the rationality assumptions in economics. Behavioral economics is now foundational to what is defined as microeconomics. And so I think that one has to be careful in exaggerating the rigidities of the system. And so I would put that on the table, number one. Number two, I think that in the comments about quantitative economics, the issue there is not is the development of a better language to demonstrate its inadequacies. In other words, you look at quantitative models in economics, one of the things they do is they were taken to data. So it's not a matter that there's esoteric theorizing with no empirical analog. In other words, the dynamic has been a relationship between quantitative models, which are theoretical, and formal empirical work. The way that I think one wants to talk about exploitation, one wants to talk about issues of power, is the demonstration that that particular juxtaposition and dynamic is not doing a good job capturing them. But once you go down that route, it also opens up the way that you would make arguments on how to talk about a richer conception of empirical work and the like. And so, again, going down that route and focusing on the last Nobel Prize, since one of the winners was one of my colleagues, the econometrics work, the formal statistical work by Asimago, Robinson, and Johnson, that's the weakest part of their argument. Their arguments are tapestries, and they would, by the way, they would acknowledge that. If you read their papers, they make fun of their regression sometimes. What they are doing is they are developing an argument that is taking evidence from historical contexts, qualitative evidence, combining it with quantitative evidence. That in philosophy of science is called abduction or inference, the best explanation. We need more of that in economics. And so all I'm putting on the table is that is happening. And so I think it's not really fair to treat it as some sort of rigid, unyielding system.
Thank you. Any further questions on the thing? Okay. I think Emeritus, and then those are the last three. Eric, raise your hand.
Hi, is this on? Yes. Okay, so this is it's a little bit cheeky, but it's also very short and definitely a question. So I walked in late, apologies, by the way, for the late entry. And is this actually on? Okay, I walked in late, sorry for the late entry. When I did, there was a screen up and it said respectable framework. We were speaking within this respectable framework, and I have been here ever since listening. And I just want to make sure, is is the unrespectable framework like historical materialism? I know I'm wearing the black flat cap and I actually look like I publish in historical materialism, which I do. So it's a bit and I don't, but it's a serious question because I feel like it's an elephant in the room. I feel like some of the stuff that we've talked about like could actually be addressed, not fully ever, but with certain, productive results within that framework. And we're not, and it's not there. So I'm just wondering if that's what the unrespectable framework is. Okay, next. Maybe you even said it at the very beginning of your presentation and I wasn't here, but just in case.
Yeah, thank you for a great discussion, Chris Hoy from the World Bank. I guess I wanted to kind of ask the panel to think like, say at the 20-year anniversary, right? Or the 30-year anniversary. So just like, I wanted to say like, put a longer time horizon on it. What do you think should be the topics that we're looking at, right? There's many people in this room who hope to be doing research for the decades to come. And I think a lot of the reflections so far have been really helpful thinking about 5-10 years. But I mean, beyond that, some of the mega trends would be interesting to hear any reflections you have.
So could you please thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the discussion. I'm Michele Bernasconi from Venice. And I would like to go back to the question, to Atkinson's question, because I think that is really the core that anybody thinking about inequality is bound to ask and try to answer. That is a very normative question. Who should own the robot? And I think that is something that I would like to have your view on it. For example, those that embrace meritocracy, who should own the robot? This is the question.
So we've got 3 questions. What is the unrespectable framework? Future thinking 30 years from now. And who should own the robots?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear completely the argument. I'm not going to comment on the unrespectable framework. I didn't mention that. I was not thinking in those terms. And regarding the question, who should own the robot? Well, that's Atkinson's question. And this is a panel about frontiers of research in inequality. That's the question. Let's do research to answer that question. And that's the point. That's not easy. Yes, but there's also a conceptual issue in the word own. To own is already a position about the robots. So let's think about the question first.
Okay. Stephen, any reflections?
Well, if you're asking about 30 years, you're really asking, well, it's almost partly by definition unanswerable. And so I think operationally your question's asking, how do we think about the emergence of robotics, artificial technology, and climate change, and how would that change the way that regardless of whether it's quantitative, qualitative, philosophical, positive, or normative, positive, et cetera, would we formulate things differently? And so I don't have the answers to that. I wish I did, obviously, but I think that's the way that I would try to conceptualize that. So going down that route, there's lots of questions you could ask. For example, one difference between artificial intelligence and traditional technical change is it's one thing to invent a new type of machine. It's another thing to invent a thing that replaces stuff that's inside here. And so one would want to think about what it means to have technical change that's removing cognitive skills. That's a qualitatively different way to formulate models that are conventional, but that's all consistent, by the way, with quantitative looking. And so, but at the end, much of this is the world is sufficiently non-stationary that that doing that type of forecasting, I think, is going to have large errors.
So I just think that the kind of the geographical arrangement of the world, in the sense of the relationship between different regions, different countries, the relationship within countries, the kind of how things are going to work out in terms of the extraordinary concentration of populations in cities, in super cities, and the way and the kind of the tensions that that creates with where other people are living. I think we have very few answers to how all that can be addressed and how any of the changes, whether with climate or robots, are going to feed into that. My suspicion is that they will further exacerbate the concentrations that we have at the moment. So I think that will be in 30 years' time. I think that will still be a major problem, unsolved.
So for the first question, you didn't unfortunately the issue this at the beginning. I don't know why Kramer didn't want to say. He actually asked AI, what should I talk about? And the AI presented that, and then gave alternatives, which included historical materialism or Marxism, frameworks, and so on. So the whole presentation, that was slightly tongue in cheek, was actually the point of it. You know, the other two questions are, in a sense, to me, the same question. So I would love to think that the current questions of inequality will be gone in 30 years and we'll have new questions. Unlikely, but I think everything we'll be doing will be shaped by the way in which these new technologies reshape our economy and our lives over the next 30 years, which is a variation. I don't think the question will be who owns the robots, but it'll be how are we dealing with the ways in which, and you know, AI is the beginning, right? One thing to remember is we're at the infancy of AI now. So it's going to be so much vastly better in 5, 10, 15, 30 years. Two is right behind it are several other technologies that will interact with it in ways that are still more transformative, including quantum computing, nanotechnologies, and robotics. If you put all that together, it's kind of hard to imagine exactly what the world is going to look like. So we're going to have to figure these questions out. I do want to offer a couple thoughts, though, for me, on large framing on how to think about those. Right. So our current way of thinking about economic policy is largely framed around people as consumers. What we're looking for are policies that increase productivity and efficiency, drive down price, because then people get access to more of the things that they want, the cheaper amounts and better. And with old technologies, we can usually do that because if they did displace jobs, they created new jobs. And so that was just a shift, and you know, we could deal with those shifts. Unlike, there are people who think that AI will be just like that. I don't. I think the difference between it and earlier technologies is its adaptability. So it can learn to do whatever new jobs it creates. And as long as our focus is on increasing productivity and efficiency, it will always be more productive and efficient than people. So we're going to have to think about a world in which we deal with people as workers, right? As part of the way we think about what we're trying to accomplish with our economic policies and our other policies. And there's two potential ways to think about that. One is trade-offs. So we'll take some losses in productivity and efficiency and price in order to ensure that we actually retain work for people. And that would be a policy matter to incentivize AI developers to develop AIs that actually create work. And that's doable. That's a way to think about it. The other is to, you know, the current system basically treats labor as we let the price of labor be determined by a conventional supply and demand curve, and then assume that all the surplus from the interaction of labor and capital gets to go to the capital holders. I mean, Keynes recognized this in the 30s. You could imagine a world in which actually let's use all this for how it maximizes productivity and the generation of surplus, and we'll just divide that differently. So we can have a world in which people's wages stay the same, instead of having fewer people doing the same amount of work. Right, we'll have everybody doing less work. So you work 15 hours a week, but you still get the same kind of salaries and livelihood because we're dividing the surplus differently. Those are both potential approaches, and I'm sure there's a ton of others. But the point being, we're gonna have to be thinking along something along those lines, and what that looks like depends on how these technologies unfold. And those, I think, will be the inequality questions that we're thinking about over the next 30 years.
Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting panel to chair. I want to thank our wonderful panelists and the audience for the questions. It has been great to have this opportunity to listen and to engage in this dialogue. We're grateful that you could find the time in your busy schedules to be here with us and with us. And I want to thank everyone who is also online that joined today. And that's it. Enjoy the